Hello, my name is Michał Oleszczyk, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you at a special event organized by the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, POLIN. This event is a part of distinguished lectures, which is a part of a global education outreach program. And during the event, we will be referring more than once to exhibition that is still to be seen at the museum, which is called Legacy of Polish Jews. And today's event, the title of it is Long Time Ago, Polish Cinema was a Polish Jewish cinema. And our distinguished guest tonight is Jim Hoberman. Hello, Jim. It's a great pleasure to have Jim as our guest. Jim is one of the most distinguished film critics and film historians working in the United States. We are connecting today via Zoom. I'm in Warsaw. Jim is in New York City. Over the years, Jim not only covered current cinema, mainly for the Village Voice for several decades, but also wrote extensively about the history of popular culture in the United States in books such as Entertaining America, Jews, Movies and Broadcasting, which is very pertinent to today's lecture, but also in a continuous series of books which cover really the post-war history of American films, such as Army of Phantoms, Dream Life, and recently Make My Day. It's a great honor to have Jim here as our guest tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Michał. And it's a pleasure to be here and to talk on behalf of the museum. And I wish that I could be actually in Warsaw, giving this talk live to an audience. But the world is as it is right now. So, we have Zoom, and it's on the screen, and here we are. I would like to start by making a few general comments about the relationship between Jews and the movies, because it's a complicated subject that has drawn a lot of attention. I mean, the impact of East European and Central European Jews on the creation of American movie industry is well known, and in fact, it's kind of mythologized. The title of Neil Gabler's 1988 bestseller, An Empire of Their Own, How the Jews Invented Hollywood, encapsulates this tale, although really the phrase might more accurately be how some Jews contributed considerably to the invention of Hollywood. I mean, however, it's certainly true that from the 1920s on, Hollywood was widely viewed as a Jewish business, and that this was not particularly complimentary. This was, but this was the prevailing view. So the question then is, what is the special relationship that exists between Jews and the motion picture industry, and really what social forces might inform this relationship? I mean, there are a number of reasons that have been given. It's undeniable that the prevalence of Jewish immigrants and their children in the American film industry was a function of immigration itself. Jews and other immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe were not just the audience for the first motion pictures, but they were almost invariably the owners of these storefront Nickelodeons, these cheap theaters that grew up in urban slum neighborhoods in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, the big American cities in the first decade of the 20th century. And as a new business, motion pictures had no established hierarchy and offered many opportunities. And I should say parenthetically that there was something that is called the Nickelodeon boom which happens around 1905 to 1908 in the US, there's nothing written about this. I mean, the what we could call, the middle class or the bourgeois press paid no attention to what was going on in these slum neighborhoods, how people were entertaining themselves. And then suddenly, they became aware that this thing was going on. So because there was no established hierarchy, it offered opportunities to immigrants. You didn't even have to know the language particularly well to get involved in movies. The most entrepreneurial of the Nickelodeon proprietors moved from being exhibitors to then becoming distributors of the films, and then from distribution to production. This is largely around the time of World War I and immediately after. Because before World War I, the major producer of movies in the entire world was France. I mean, even in the United States, most movies came from France. And that's when Hollywood develops in the 20s, and that's when you have, the idea it becomes a Jewish business, or is seen that way. This, however, does not necessarily account for the prominence of Jews in the creation of film industries in many other countries, including Austria, Germany, Hungary, and especially Poland. And I think that Poland is a really special case, because one could make the argument, and I would, that Polish Jews were even more crucial to the development of Polish cinema than they were instrumental in the creation of Hollywood. And why might this be so? At the dawn of the 20th century, Polish Jews were conspicuous throughout the nascent culture industry. I mean, what later became the mass media. This would include popular journalism, commercial photography, and cabaret. Also, various political movements that were developing. And in part, this is due to a process of secularization and acculturation. And this is something that is in some ways specific to the Jewish situation, because there was a form of internal migration that was going on in Eastern Europe, and particularly in Poland, I think, in which young Jews, some arriving from further east and resettling, relocating in Poland, others coming from the countryside, from small villages to the large cities, left their religious traditions behind to pursue greater freedom, economic opportunity, and social mobility. And another way of saying is that to join the modern world. I mean, there was an opportunity to do that, and that was tremendously appealing to many young people. And again, movies were something new that did not require any special training or enormous capital. Although I do think it's interesting that in Warsaw in particular, the movement came not from journalism so much as from commercial photography. And I believe that probably Jews were quite prominent in that field as well, which again was something new that didn't require any prior training. It's not something that you really inherited. It's something that you would pick up. Then too, there was a sizable Jewish public, particularly in Warsaw and Łódź, in Białystok, in the larger cities, that was hungry for something that in some ways took the place of the kind of all-encompassing culture which traditional Judaism supplied. So I think that this had something to do with this interest in culture and mass culture, and not just mass culture, but culture in general. And so even in the late 19th century, Jews constituted a majority of the theater patrons in Warsaw, and the same would be true of the first movies. Now, how this situation differed very markedly from that in the United States and elsewhere is that on the eve of World War I, approximately 1/3 of all the movies that were produced in Congress, Poland, were adapted from Yiddish plays, which means that there was an indigenous Jewish film culture that developed in Poland, and this is something that continued really in some respects up till World War II. Because the two most internationally acclaimed Yiddish movies of the 1930s, and by that I mean the movies that were most widely distributed, that at least in the case of one of them was recognized as an art film. These are Joseph Greene's Yidel mit dem Fiddle, to give its Yiddish title. In English, there's no way to politely translate it into English. It would be Little Jew with a fiddle. And the Dybbuk were not only produced by Polish Jews, but made in the Yiddish language. So there you have, that would be the peak, I would say, of a Polish Jewish cinema, although not the end, but certainly it reached its peak in the late 1930s. So just to backtrack a little bit, Jewish moviegoers as well as movie makers were the shock troops of modernity, and in the early 20th century, nothing was more modern than the movies, almost, because as I said, Polish film industry actually predates the modern Polish state by a decade. So to speak more specifically, who were these people who started it? The two fathers of, or the fathers among the fathers, but I think that these are maybe the two most significant fathers of the Polish film industry, were a pair of rival exhibitors, Alexander Hertz and Mordechai Taubin. And they had adjacent theaters located on Warsaw's Grand Boulevard, Marszałkowska Street. And Hertz, in 1909, founded Poland's first indigenous production company, Sphinx. Initially, he was concerned with making short newsreels, and he was somebody who had some cultural aspirations and serious. I mean, he did an early production of Meyer as Is that okay?
Meyer mm-hmm.
Thank you. I apologize for my.
No. It's excellent. Meyer Ezofowicz is the Polish title of it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which is a story about an idealistic Jew revolting against clerical constraints and joining the struggle for Polish freedom, which is again a specifically Polish and Polish Jewish story. So that was kind of an art film that he made. Taubin had actually gone into production earlier and had a more topical sense. He made a movie about the 1901 student strike, in which school children and their parents revolted against the forced Germanization of their education. So these guys were both in production before anybody else. They had very different personalities and business strategies. Hertz was a very respectable guy. He wanted to be considered a patron of the arts. Taubin was, who named his company Siła, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, meaning strength, was famous for all kinds of shenanigans, fictitious bankruptcies, double bookkeeping. He wasn't great about paying his debts. He actually briefly went to jail for some kind of thing. So they were very different types. And they're the two, you in a funny sort of way, you get the two aspirations of cinema there. One, that it could be a kind of, the seventh art, it could be a high art, and the other that it's this form of show business where anything goes. Taubin is the one, however, who pioneered the making of films drawn from the Yiddish theater, which is very, very significant thing in Polish film history, but also in a world cinema. The idea of using dramatic plays, as the basis to make movies. I mean, other people began doing that in other countries. He was not influenced by what was going on, let's say, in France or in Russia so much as the interests of his audience. He knew his public and the availability of these theatrical troops. So basically, what they did was they would come to a theater and just document the play, and then add titles and so on, and then they would have a film. The company that he was most involved with was Avraham Kaminsky, and if the name sounds familiar, that's because that was Ida Kaminsky's father. I mean, it was really the most popular, and also in a way the resilient of Yiddish theater companies in Poland. So they made a number of films together. With Siła, between 1911 and 1913, about a third of all Polish films would be based on Yiddish plays. And they also, adapted plays. They did the same thing with the Polish stage too. I mean, they made movies based on them as well. The same principle is you go to the theater with the camera, set it up, and document what was going on. Siła, went out of business. It was bought up by another company, Cosmo Film, which specialized in these theatrical presentations, and existed for 2 years. It released about 20 movies, most of which were these theatrical productions. Then it was incorporated into Sphinx. So it was the most prolific company in Poland before World War I. Still, none of the companies were able to market their movies beyond the Russian Empire at this point. There's one exception. The movies that featured the first international Polish star, POLIN, who was actually discovered by Alexander Hertz, and made a number of movies for Sphinx, eight melodramas for Sphinx. She also made a film during the German occupation of Warsaw during World War I, financed for a German company and derived from a popular Yiddish play, The Yellow Ticket. Concerns a young Jewish woman who is played by Negri, who must register as a prostitute. That's the Yellow Ticket. And in order to attend the university outside the Pale of Settlement. It's a Russian story, but it was filmed in Warsaw on location in the Nalewki, the Jewish neighborhood in Warsaw, and it made a great impression on Negri. I mean, she writes about it in her memoirs. We were all inspired in making The Yellow Passport. Its sympathetic portrait of Jews might displease some of the population, but a vast majority would be very moved by it. It might even help to spread a little tolerance and understanding. It also, gave her a kind of yellow passport because, years later when she met the Nazi hierarchy in Berlin, they remembered that she had played a Jew. They brought it up to her. They found her, like a suspicious or tainted in some way. Anyway, that she made this movie En route to Berlin, where she starred in about 20 films, and then moved on to Hollywood with her director Ernst Lubitsch, who and then became a significant Hollywood star in the 20s as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, I before I follow up with a question, I just want to say and remind our viewers that there will be also a Q&A session afterwards. So around the, let's say, 40-minute mark of this talk between us, I will open this up, and if there are any questions, you can ask them in our YouTube channel via the chat box. Yes, well, it's a fascinating period, also very difficult to study because so many of the films are lost, and it's merely a fraction that survives. It's oftentimes it involves studying and reading about lost work. But I wanted to elaborate on the question of what do you think, how this feeling that that you mentioned, that modernity, this sort of jump into modernity, was so vitally, intricately connected to the Jewish sense of self-understanding at the time. How do you see it in those films that were shot in Yiddish and also presented, as I presume, and partly know from your work, presented internationally and very prominently in the States for the Jewish immigrant community? How those films produced in these parts shown, let's say, on First Avenue in New York, what did they communicate to their audiences?
Well, it's, you have to start with the premise that Yiddish theater was itself a modern development. I mean, there was no particular Jewish theatrical tradition. I mean, there were some holiday pageants and so on, but there was no theatrical tradition until the late 19th century. And Yiddish was a vernacular language. It wasn't taken seriously as a literary language at all. So the Jewish literature, to the degree that it existed, would have been written mainly in Hebrew. So Yiddish theater was a popular art and something that in itself had connotations of secularization and so on. So that's a modern thing that Jews were basically doing for themselves, because there was the only audience, really, with very rare exceptions, for Yiddish theater then would have been a Jewish audience. In a larger sense, you have, with the industrialization, that's going on now, that has reached across Europe, greater urbanization, and so on. Lots of people are leaving the countryside and going to the cities. The difference for Jews is that they were more insular in the countryside and so on. And when they, the cities had a kind of dynamic excitement that enabled people to feel like they could cast off certain traditions and change themselves. And this is why I think I would say the Jews were a shock troop for modernity, really in many places in Europe. I mean, but especially in Eastern Europe and I guess in the Habsburg Empire and so on. Less so in Russia, because it was a much more controlled situation. There was much less less freedom available than there would have been further west.
Mm-hmm. Just to dwell a little bit more on the Yiddish films that were produced here. Well, some of them, addressed the tensions of modernity in a variety of ways, like Tevye, for example, based on Michał Oleszczyk's stories, later adapted into Fiddler on the Roof. But where would you place the most famous one? And I mean their book, which on the surface seems to plunge into those folk tales and the religious life that modernity itself was a little bit trying to distance itself from.
Well, the Dybbuk is a very complicated artifact, and I mean, and it certainly draws on religion, on folk religion, on a kind of all sorts of traditions that would be specific to East European Jews, but it was it was assembled and created from a very from a what was then a contemporary point of view. In other words, Shen Ansky, the guy who wrote it, was largely born in Russia and lived there for most of his life. Was not religious himself. He had an ethnographic interest in the traditions of the shtetl. He was a folklorist, and he was collecting material, excuse me, for a museum which existed for a while in St. Petersburg, and the Dybbuk comes out of that. Out of the material that was collected. So this is a modernist point of view, I think. To see this material as artifactual, as historical. I mean, the whole story of the Dybbuk is not, yes, you can find things if you're. I mean, there's the way Jewish tradition is vast. So there's certainly you can find references to this, but basically it's a folk belief, and it also in its relation to what was then called hysteria. I mean, you could see it as very. I mean, the Dybbuk has Freudian aspects, not necessarily because Ansky was reading Freud, but because like Freud, he was working with what we could call dreams, unconscious material and so on. So the Dybbuk is a really, I mean, that's a very it's on the one hand it's an anomaly, although other things followed. I mean, there are similar works that were produced, but it really was the first, and also it had popular appeal too, so that the production that was introduced in Warsaw actually after Ansky died was enormously popular, not just with Jews but with a general Polish audience, and that proved true. I mean, even as it's introducing this kind of, what you could call it, like a Hasidic Gothic. I mean, a number of writers, actors, choreographers, and so on came from very religious backgrounds, and they did not want to live in that. They broke free of the constraints, but then they used it in their work. I'll say one thing about the Dybbuk that's about the movie is that when the movie opened in Poland, and it got like the play. I mean, it had a widespread appeal. It was criticized both for being too Jewish, which one could expect, but also for being too Polish, as being like having ripped off like certain traditional Polish 19th century Polish material. So.
It certainly can strike a chord with the romantic imagination of 19th century, like Adam Mickiewicz, and this fascination with the folk horror. But let's mention the name of Michał Waszyński, who directed it, and this may also serve as a springboard to ask you about other key figures in the 30s, before the war, of Polish Jews that were instrumental and key in Polish film industry. And I think Waszyński probably should come here as number one, or
I think so. I mean, Waszyński is yes. I mean, he certainly I mean, I'm not sure. I'm curious to what position, how he's regarded in the history of Polish cinema these days. I mean, I'm guessing that there's been a kind of revival of interest in him recently.
Yeah, yeah. I think he's treated as possibly the only pre-war director, with the exception of Józef Lejtes, who has some sort of a personal style or you know, like a touch of you know, technical proficiency that makes him into an auteur, I would say.
Yeah, and also tremendously prolific, could work in any genre. I mean, he's reminiscent of certain Hollywood directors who just could do that. You know, they could sort of take whatever came. So yes, he's a significant figure. It's also interesting that he kind of returned to his roots when he directed the Dybbuk. I mean, to the I mean, he came from a quite a traditional background and cast it off. I mean, so that, you know, there are stories. I mean, the Dybbuk was a kind of super production in the 30s, very expensive. And, you know, one account of it is that there's a lot of newspaper accounts and so on, that he was always had somebody beside him who would, you know, like who could handle the Yiddish. But the thing is that Wyszynski grew up speaking Yiddish. He could certainly understand it, but that was not part of his identity when he was making films. And, you know, the thing is that in the 30s, you had a very interesting situation where I think there were maybe 7 major studios, and 6 of the 7 were administered, if not owned, by Polish Jews. And there were other directors too. I mean, Lejtes, as you know, as you mentioned, was Jewish, and Julius Garden. I mean, there were a number, you know, men who changed their names and so on, were working in the industry. What you didn't have were Jewish performers on the screen. Very, very few. I mean, and when they were in, you know, in the book, there's a wonderful photograph of Nora Ney, and but she never played a Jewish character in the movies, and even, you know, she was an anomaly. Lily Liliana is another one. She's in the Dybbuk, so, and, you know, and appeared in other Yiddish films, but she, that was, you know, she was not. Yes,
this is the picture of Nora Ney that you are referring to.
Nora Ney, yeah. You know, I know her daughter.
Ah, okay.
That was for many years the publicist for the New York Film Festival.
Right.
And Nora, you know, came to the United States after the war, but she did not get back into movies.
Right, right.
Yeah, it was not like POLIN. She wasn't able to.
Right.
So my point is, so the Jews were active as camera operators, you know, technicians, and also to a degree composers, writers, and so on. All, you know, like, but above the line, no, they were not
right.
prominent.
I think we have to definitely, and of course with Wyszynski, he had a longer history, which was later explored by the wonderful documentary, the Prince and the book, and he had some sort of a second life, a second film life in post-war Hollywood, I should say, or Hollywood on the Tiber.
It was more in Italy that
Italy.
He had it. In fact, you know, I found out about Wyszynski in some ways through Joanna Ney, because she knew him when she was a child. I mean, so
right. I wanted to mention Alexander Ford, and especially his film Mir Kummer On, which I think is in some ways, also because it still exists and we can watch it. It's I think one of the key texts in this story. So if we could focus on Alexander Ford for a moment.
Oh, absolutely. And Alexander Ford would be the other key figure, you know, in this particular account of Polish cinema, Polish Jewish cinema. I'll come back to him in a second. There's another. The third one is Joseph Greene, who was a Polish Jew who came to the United States as an actor and then returned to Poland to direct Yiddish language films, which really functioned as co-productions. I mean, they were Polish films, but it was made with American stars and so on. So he's but Ford is somebody who was involved in documentaries, not exclusively, but that's how he started, making kind of experimental or political documentaries. And he too seems to have had a fairly traditional background that he cast off, changed his name, and a very modern name, right, Ford, and made, among other things, this remarkable documentary, Mir Kumanon, We're on Our Way, was how they translated it into English, which was financed by the Jewish Labor Fund, and it was filmed in the Medem Sanitarium for youth, and so it's a kind of precursor of neorealism, one could say. I mean, a very controversial film in Poland, but for different reasons than the Dybbuk, because it shows solidarity between striking Polish miners and the children in this in this sanitarium, and so it was regarded as politically problematic. It actually had a much greater currency in the U.S. and France, the U.K. and so on than it did in Poland, where it functioned as an underground film. Anyway, Ford, after the war, went on to be, the leading figure for some time in the Polish film industry, and even make some of the most successful films of the 1950s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And late in life, he actually made a adaptation of Solzhenitsyn's anti-Stalinist novel, The First Circle, which is a different story. But I wanted just for a second to dwell on the 30s, and then we'll move on. It's incredible that this is the very same year that Ford makes this progressive documentary, because I think the modernity and progressivism go hand in hand. In the States, there's this at the same time there's this incredible eruption of progressive film work, King Vidor's Our Daily Bread, and many others. Was there any kind of a correspondence between those two worlds? Let's say the Jewish thought, Jewish Polish filmmakers, the left-wing progressive art of the 1930s in the States?
Well, I think that in general, Polish films were not. I mean, they would not have been distributed. Although Wyszynski's films did open, many of them in the United States. I mean, the situation in the United States for foreign language films is that they generally played in theaters that specialized in movies for specific immigrant groups. So that there were theaters in New York that showed nothing but Spanish language films that were made in Spain or Argentina, for the Spanish speaking audience. There were films theaters that tended to show Yiddish language films, and there also was at least one theater that I know of. You're familiar with New York, so I can tell you where the location was, on Houston Street. It later was turned into reinvented as a theater. It's turned into a hotel or something. But in the 1930s, that theater was called the Chopin, and there was also a Chopin theater in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, which was a Polish neighborhood then. And these theaters showed Polish language films, and they, and really just for their neighborhood audience. I mean, there was almost no attention paid to these films by, the daily critics and so on. The Dybbuk is a rare exception, at least in New York. So I think there might have been, well, there certainly were political allies of the Jewish Labor Bund in New York and elsewhere in the United States. And in fact, that's how there happens to be a print of Mir Kumanan. It belonged to, a socialist group in New York, which is how many people got to see it. I don't think that there would have been any specific, influence one way or the other. I mean, I can't imagine that King Vidor's film would have been shown in Poland in the 1930s.
I guess to trace the real influence, you would have to move further east, because I think it was the Soviet cinema that really inspired this progressive work with Dziga Wiertów, who was born in Białystok, right? By the way. So, and of course, the Second World War and the Holocaust causes this sort of seismic, cosmic disruption of the process that you are describing now. But if we focus on the sort of immediate post-war moment, or even like the late war moment, where can we see the survivors of the Holocaust in the Polish film industry, and is what's happening with the group of people?
Well, there were of course, like a number of prominent Jewish filmmakers who died during the war or were murdered by the Germans. So there's a whole, that's. But there were a number that survived, almost all of whom survived the war by going further east, and they basically survived in the Soviet Union. And they then joined the Red Army, established the Ceausescu division, and Ford and others joined that as filmmakers. And another group, which would include Leites and Wyszynski, were attached to the Free Polish Army, to Anders' army, also making films. So there were a group of filmmakers who continued to work during the war. I mean, Ford is the most important in a way, because he, created a film in 1944, Majdanek, the Cemetery of Europe. Possibly the first movie about the death camps, and he was, attached to the Ceausescu division. And then when after the war, when Film Polski was established, he became the head of production. The other two, Wyszynski and Leites, with Anders' army, Anders' army sort of went through the Middle East, and then back up into Europe. Had a number of the Jewish filmmakers just when the army went through Palestine, they stayed. And that was that's what happened with Leites, and he made or worked on the first movie that was made in Mandate Palestine. Wyszynski continued into Italy, and just as you said, completely reinvented himself. When he died, his obituary in Variety is hilarious. I mean, it's like Prince, Michał Wyszynski. I mean, he just completely invented a past history for him. But he was involved in he was Orson Welles' assistant on Othello and so on. He had an interesting career, but did not look back. Ford, on the other hand, was very much concerned with creating the new Polish cinema, and he, there was also, I would say, a kind of a brief parallel development where a person whose name I haven't mentioned, Shaul Gaston, was a kind of angel for independent cinema in Poland in the 30s, including including Yiddish language films, but also documentaries and so on. And so he had worked with Ford, and Ford offered him, the job of being the head of one of the units, but he didn't want to. He wanted to continue making Yiddish films, which he did for several years after the war. There were some, and one in particular that's quite significant. But the climate had changed so drastically. I mean, that it was not possible really to have any kind of specific Yiddish cinema once the communists consolidated power in 1948. And the great example of this is Ford's Border Street, which I think is probably his most significant film in certainly ambitious in ways that in a way that could not be repeated. I mean, he wanted to make a movie about the war, specifically about a neighborhood that was had a mixed population, which is to say, it was a Polish-Jewish neighborhood. It refers to the Warsaw Ghetto. I mean, it has, it also refers to the Free Polish Army, because he started making this in 1947 when it was still possible to take a wider view of what had happened during the war. And it is, as with Mir Kumanon, I mean, it's a movie about Polish and Polish-Jewish solidarity and so on. And so it was shelved, and then because it was a Czech co-production, it got sent to the Venice Film Festival. It got a lot of attention there, and then it opened in Poland. It did quite well, and then it got shut down again. I mean, it was during the once the Soviet policies turned very openly anti-Semitic after the creation of Israel and so on.
And it was, I think, the first and for a longer time the only representation of the uprising in the ghetto in Warsaw as well. I mean, since the Stalinist period, is in full swing in late 40s and early 50s. Usually, the next period that's being discussed is the so-called Polish Film School, which included people like Wajda chiefly, but also Munch, addressing the wartime experience from a variety of vantage points. And I wanted to ask you about that particular time, and perhaps about Andrzej Munch especially, who I believe is still severely underrated as an international filmmaker. But his Jewish identity, I think, is absolutely key to understanding his work.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that initially in the Stalinist period, it was socialist realism was the mandated style, and many things were prescribed and so on. It was very difficult. And then you had a kind of thaw around 1954. First, you had the black documentaries, so-called, which I think Munch was involved in. I mean, documentaries that they're not hypercritical, but they certainly did not paint a rosy picture necessarily of the rebuilding of Poland. And then you had the so-called Polish school, which was to a great degree fostered by Ford. I mean, Wajda had been Ford's assistant director, and then Wajda went on to have a really a sensational career in the 50s. I mean, not just in Poland, but internationally. I mean, he was, in the 1950s, he was, on par with Bergman, Kurosawa, Fellini, and so as an internationally, known director. Munch never had, I don't think, that degree of visibility. Although his movies did turn up in the United States, but they did not get a release the way that Vidas did. Incidentally, we should mention that Vidas is then the next person to mention the Warsaw Ghetto in Samson, 1961. Not one of his more successful movies, but interesting that he did that. It was easier for Vida. Vida, showed greater interest really than any other director of his generation in putting Polish Jews on the screen. I mean, there were several prominent directors of Jewish backgrounds. I mean, Munch would be the most significant, and but there's also Morgenstern and Hoffman, and then the next genius of Polish international film, Roman Polanski, who's a whole other story about this background.
Right. What about the American reception of those films? You mentioned that Canal was this spectacular success. It won the Silver Palm at the Cannes Film Festival.
Yeah.
And I think 2 years prior, I may get the chronology wrong, but Ford, he won the Best Director for a now obscure film called the Five Boys from Barska Street.
Yeah.
So it seems, which by the way is quite good, but it seems that there was this moment of interest, but where those films, for example, Canal, like a film like Canal, which was so violent and brutally almost like veristic in its portrayal of the war. Were those films treated in the States? What was the reaction to this unrelenting realism?
Yeah, I think that Canal was was more controversial than Ashes and Diamonds. I mean, Ashes and Diamonds was, because I think was probably the bigger hit. But I know that Canal was, they both were released commercially. I mean, I saw Canal in as an undergraduate, in the Film Society, which meant that it was possible to rent a 16mm film. I was amazed by it, I must say, that it actually made a bigger impression on me than Ashes and Diamonds, which I also really admire. But Canal, the visceral quality of Canal is really, I mean, there are very few movies that have that degree of power, and I think that was recognized when it came out. Doesn't mean that people liked it, but necessarily that critics liked it, but they saw that there was something there, something very simple.
I somehow I always thought that for a viewer in the mid-50s in the States, Canal would be sort of in the same vein that Wages of Fear, like this unrelenting spectacle of cruelty. But how about Munch and just to stay with Munch for a second, I was always amazed that The Passenger, which by now I think is recognized as one of masterpieces of the early 60s. I think that Godard said that it's one of the best films ever made. It wasn't really appreciated. I found this tiny blurb by Bosley Crowther, who basically dismissed it, said it had lesbian overtones, which was a put down for him, and that was basically it. It was this long. What do you make of that lack of Munch's recognition?
Well, I think that probably when The Passenger appeared, it appeared as a an unfinished posthumous film, so that people, didn't. It seemed like a very specialized thing, and I don't know that Eroica. I probably got some kind of release. I mean, also, there were some films were shown as forms of cultural exchange. Be interesting. I mean, and also there were films that for example would show more in Chicago, than elsewhere in the United States, because there was a large enough Polish-speaking audience there to create interest in the films. And I just think that Monk is a more subtle director in many respects than, more, there's a kind of sardonic quality to Monk's films that, could get by audiences and so on. I mean, there's no way not to be affected by the Vaida films. You might hate them, but they're it's similar to Kurosawa. He's a very visceral filmmaker, and those films could work with an American audience because Americans were used to action movies, and Monk's films, are more they're trickier, they're more subtle. I would.
Right. Well, I just want to say again that if there are any questions that our listeners want to ask, it's not that I monopolize the conversation. It's just that we don't have any questions at this moment. But I'm sure that there will be some, and even the conversation will be listened to many times over later on. It will stay on the YouTube channel. But if there are any questions, please don't hesitate. I will also say this in Polish. Jeżeli są jakiekolwiek pytania, bardzo proszę, można zadawać. Przetłumaczę je na angielski. So moving on, and also, sort of more closer to our contemporary era, 1970s, 1980s, I think were time when Poland as a political entity entered the imagination, I think, of the Western audience more. Were there any filmmakers or films at that period that you would like to showcase?
Well, I mean, I would say Poland re-entered, since it,
re-entered, right.
But I think that in terms of, we're talking about the Jewish contribution or component to Polish cinema. I mean, it was dealt another blow in 1968 by the anti-Zionist, or I don't know how it's referred to in.
Both as anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic, yes.
Yes, okay. So that's even when Alexander Ford finally left, and along with about 10,000 Jews who were mainly, assimilated. A number of them were or had been communists. They were part of the the ruling group in some cases. Anyway, so that I maybe put an end to things. And of course, Polanski had become an international director by that point. And whereas his short films, I think, have a certain interesting component. There's one in particular where he has the two Jewish actors show up in this town and be, run into he's thinking of something there. But Knife in the Water, which was the most successful Polish film since Ashes and Diamonds, at least with an international audience, and then he left and didn't come back again for decades.
And the first Polish nominee for Best International Oscar, or foreign language Oscar, as it was called then.
Knife in the Water.
Yes, the first one.
Yes, yeah, and I think it was shown in the first New York Film Festival. I mean, it was a very, that got a lot of attention. But in a way, that got attention because it showed a Poland which was very European. It was. Yes, the movie was made in Poland, and there would have been lots of specific things, but still, one could imagine it. One could imagine Michelangelo Antonioni, making this a version of this. So I think that in the 70s, when you have the cinema of moral anxiety and so on, you can find a few. References to Jewish characters. You have to really be able to read it very, very closely. But the films that again, were international successes. I mean, you have Vaida once more. I mean, not that he ever disappeared, but he had a kind of comeback with Man of Marble and Without Anesthesia. And his other films. I mean, And then, Zanussi, and Kieślowski. I mean, so that Polish cinema was certainly back on the international stage. One of the things that interested me was that in the absence of the general absence of Jews in Poland, you got these kind of nostalgic films. The sign at the sanitarium at the sign of the hourglass, based on Bruno Schulz, and Osteria is another, one, and even Vida's film, Vida's version of Promised Land, which was quite controversial,
right,
in the United States, that there, it was sort of like exhuming the past, or there was a strange quality to those films.
Mm-hmm.
Very recently, something has happened. I was going to leave this perhaps to the end, but I mean, you had Polanski's return to make The Pianist, a movie which evidently wanted to make right after the war. I mean, make a movie, and it was impossible. Actually, right after the war, I guess, in the late 40s, wanted to make. That was impossible. So you had that Polanski, and he won the Palme d'Or for that, and an Oscar.
Yes.
Even though he couldn't go back to collect it, it was. And you had Agnieszka Holland, who is, has a Jewish background, coming back and making, among other things, the film that she made in Lviv. I'm trying to remember what the time, In Darkness.
Darkness, yes, 2011. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I learned, I think from you, that she had made a version of the Dybbuk, which is quite good. For
yes,
it's
the
really
TV
yeah.
production. Yes, she did, and I think she was singular in I think in addressing the issues of Polish Jewish history, of Polish anti-Semitism, but also with this whole complex identity. I mean, identity is her real subject.
That's right. Yeah.
Europa, right, and Bitter Harvest, I think.
Yeah, and which is itself an interesting book. But I mean, how it came to be written, by these an American and a Polish political prisoners. They write it together in jail. Mm-hmm. But I think that when Agnieszka Holland leaves after 1981, I mean, she leaves with martial law pretty much, and reestablishes herself in Europe. She has these two movies, Angry Harvest and Europa, right? Is that the
Europa? Mm-hmm. Yes.
Produced by another Polish Jew who's living in Germany, and is like the in a way the most significant producer of foreign films in Germany, a very controversial guy. I mean, in West Germany, so that they between them they set up some kind of like exiled Polish cinema. Arthur Brauner is his name.
Right. Slowly drawing this to an end, but also I wanted to ask you about this very brief window in the 60s and 70s when I think you referred to it in one of your texts as the Junior wave. When suddenly there were those people, and I'm the broad definition now. I mean, Ida Kaminska, who is nominated for an Oscar. Then she plays Angel Levine. Then Molly Picon is in Fiddler on the Roof. Actually, she was in the Yiddish with the fiddle. And but there's also those films based on Philip Roth and many new voices. At that point, do you see any again connection, inspiration. I always thought that the Hourglass Sanatorium could have inspired some drug-related movies in the 70s. It could become a midnight movie.
More the Saragossa manuscript.
Saragossa manuscript.
That was a midnight movie.
Yeah. So, is there any osmosis or exchange between this new identity of Jewish actors and filmmakers in the 70s and Poland?
Well, I think that there was, it's an interesting moment the late 60s is an interesting moment in Hollywood because the industry is very confused. They don't know what's happened to their audience and who it is and so on. And so a lot of unusual movies get made, and it provided, it coincided with the prominence of a certain generation of American Jewish novelists and also stand-up comedians and so on, and so that's what produced that moment, which lasted only for a few years, really. In terms of the films, most of them, almost all of them, are set in the United States. Really, most of them in New York, and some of them are so specific to New York neighborhoods that critics question, who would even look at this movie? Sidney Lumet's Bye Bye Braverman and so on. But there was one movie, Polanski's Diary of a Horse Thief, which was shot in Yugoslavia and based on writings by Joseph Opatashu, the Yiddish novelist. He wrote Polish Velder in Polish Woods, and his son David Opatashu acted in Yiddish films and so on. And so that was a kind of, there was definitely a European flavor to that film, which did very badly. I think the only extant print is in a Finnish film archive. So
right, just to make it clear, it's Avraham Polanski, not Roman Polanski.
Right? That's right, Avraham Polanski.
No, it's you said it right. I just saying for our listeners. And also I felt maybe that Hester Street by John McLean Silver had this in portraying the Eastern European immigrant, I guess.
Yeah, and Angel Levine also, which was a Czech director.
Right. And Ida Kaminsky with Harry Belafonte. We still have no questions, so I guess there's no questions at this moment. But again, if anyone wants to ask, I will ask my last question, and we'll see if there's any questions that are from the audience. Specifically, I wanted to ask you about the one instance, which I'm curious what you think about it. I know that you were quite critical of the movie itself. Schindler's List, but the gesture of Spielberg coming to Poland to make the film, and also hiring a number of Polish film technicians, artists, some of them also of Jewish origins. I think whatever one thinks of the film, I think it was a quite significant gesture of reconnecting with those two worlds. How do you see this?
Yes, well, I know that it was instrumental in sort of recreating a culture or an ambience in Krakow.
Yes.
I'm sorry I haven't had the chance to see firsthand, but I know about that. I would say that, one thing that Spielberg did, and you're right, I have a lot of problems with the movie, but I have to get to that. It's evident to me that he also looked at a lot of films that were produced in Eastern Europe during the 60s. More, I would say, Czech than Polish, but you can see things that he's paying attention to them. The movie that's the most evident in Schindler's List, I think, is Distant Journey. Is the Czech film that's actually came out around 1950 and then was shelved for a long time and so on. So in that sense, I think that Spielberg made a conscious attempt to connect with a tradition of filmmaking which was not a Hollywood tradition. So I think that one can say that he was absorbing other films that had existed. I mean, so I want to mention a film that I think is, that I like better, that I think does the same kind of thing, and that's Pawlikowski's Ida.
Right. We may close with that. Yes.
Yeah. Where you have somebody who was born in Poland, went with his family at some point to England, became a filmmaker in the UK, and then came back to Poland to make a fascinating movie. I mean, it really is it was so interesting. I mean, I'm sure many of you have seen it, but if not, the premise has to do with a woman who was brought up in an orphanage, and she's about to take her vows to become a nun, and then she discovers that her parents had been Jews who left her there, and not only that, she has a surviving aunt who is a judge, and is herself a complicated character. Anyway, so it really is a very fraught and haunting movie. But Pawlikowski also deliberately used the style of the Polish New Wave. Yes. The films of the early 60s. I mean, he recreated that, and he since made another movie in Cold War. After that, I don't know if he's going to continue to make in Poland, but it really brought things full circle, I think, in some ways.
Okay, absolutely. No, I think that. And paradoxically, and I would say this, that it was exactly the visual language of the film that sort of made it stand out incredibly from, now it seems that it started a trend. There are many movies shot in this narrow black and white format. I think that can be ascribed to Ida's influence. Well, I think this is a subject that is so wide that there is no way that we will exhaust it today. But I want to thank you so much for pointing to all those individual artists trends. I also definitely recommend to our readers the catalog for the exhibition and the exhibition itself. The catalog is available both in English and in Polish, and you can read Jim's long essay in which there are many more tropes. So hopefully this will be only the start. And if you want to follow Jim's writing, nowadays he writes for a number of titles, for New York Times, Tablet Magazine, a New York Review of Books, among some others. But well, thank you again for finding. Oh, wait a second. There's a question. So let's.
Okay.
What connections, if any, might be drawn between the post-war Yiddish documentary Unsere Kinder and Polish cinema of both 1930s and the 40s and following decades?
Okay, well, between the 30s, I think that there's a real connection between that film and Mir Kumanon, the Alexander Ford film. I mean, in focusing on children, on an actual institution. I mean, it was shot in a real place. It's a kind of stage documentary in the same sense. I mean, and it's no. I think that there's almost a straight line between those two films. Although, of course, there's this traumatic event that occurs in between. So that Unsere Kinder is also one of the first films about the Holocaust. I'm not sure that there was anything comparable that was made, in the Polish state cinema at at that time. And in fact, Unser Kinder couldn't have been shown in Poland. They couldn't even finish it. It had to be shipped. There's a whole cloak and dagger story of how that film still exists.
There's one more question.
Okay, coming in at the end. Yeah,
you have a few minutes. There's a question about is there any documented co-production between Hollywood and Polish studios in 20s and 30s?
No, but as I said, Joseph Greene's films were he made 4 films in Poland, starting with Yiddish Films, 4 films between 1936 and 1939. I mean, those were co-productions. They were American Polish co-productions, although they were not Hollywood movies. They were independently financed in the United States. So they're actually significant in the history of independent film in America. But those are the co-productions.
Oh, that's great. I will just mention that those films, by the way, most of the Yiddish films were for decades very difficult to find. But recently there was this Blu-ray edition. I think it's called The Jewish Soul. That you participated in. There's a number of well, maybe not pristine, but as the best possible print of those films.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of that material comes from Polish archives and also French archives.
Right. Well, again, I think these were the questions that we got. So, Jim, thank you so much. This was invaluable, and I hope that it will inspire many of our listeners to pursue the topic and to learn more about Polish-Jewish connection in film.
Yes, and I hope the next time I do this talk, I can do it live in Poland.
Absolutely wonderful. So let's hope that we have you as our guest. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody who listened today. Thank you to the staff of the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, POLIN. And this was part of the distinguished lecture for the Global Education Outreach Program. And our guest was Jim Hoberman. Have a good night.